The day a country goes bankrupt, the sun still rises. The shops open, the traffic moves, children go to school. On the surface, nothing has changed. The buildings are still standing, the roads are still there. And yet, something fundamental has already died, quietly, invisibly, in the ledgers of institutions most people will never see. What dies is not money. What dies is trust. This is the first thing you need to understand about sovereign bankruptcy, and it is the thing that almost no one tells you. A country does not go bankrupt because it runs out of money. A country goes bankrupt because the world stops believing its promises. The physical reality of the nation, its land, its people, its infrastructure, remains completely intact. But in the invisible architecture of global finance, a verdict has been delivered, and that verdict reshapes everything. Countries rarely run out of money. They run out of credibility. Now, before we go further, there is a distinction you need to make, because not all countries are created equal when it comes to debt. And this distinction will determine whether a country's collapse looks like a violent foreclosure or a slow, quiet suffocation. The question is simple. What currency do you owe in? If you are a country like Greece or Argentina, and you have borrowed in a currency you cannot print, the euro, the US dollar, then your situation is mathematical. You either have the foreign currency to repay or you don't. There's no lever to pull. No printing press that saves you. Your creditors hold the door, and when the door closes, it closes completely. This is financial foreclosure. It is abrupt, it is brutal, and it is very public. But if you are a country like the United States, or Japan, or the United Kingdom, countries that borrow in their own currency, then your bankruptcy does not look like bankruptcy at all. It looks like inflation. You don't default on the debt, you quietly dilute it. You print the currency needed to repay, and in doing so, you repay less in real terms than you borrowed. The creditors receive their dollars, but those dollars buy less. The debt is honored on paper, but it is betrayed in purchasing power. Two bankruptcies, two completely different faces. One is loud and catastrophic. The other is invisible and gradual. For the countries in the first category, the ones without monetary sovereignty, failure carries a specific, devastating consequence. They are subjected to what could only be called financial excommunication. The global bond market closes its doors to them. Capital flees, currency collapses, and then, from the silence, a phone call arrives. The IMF is on the line. The International Monetary Fund presents itself as a rescuer, a lender of last resort, the institution that extends a hand when no one else will. But there is another way to describe what the IMF does, and it is more accurate. The IMF is the global liquidator. It does not arrive to save the patient, it arrives to manage the inventory. When the IMF provides emergency liquidity, it does so in exchange for something far more valuable than interest payments. It exchanges money for sovereignty. The borrowing country must agree to a structural adjustment program, a set of conditions designed theoretically to restore fiscal balance. In practice, what this means is austerity. And austerity, stripped of its technical language, is surgery without anesthesia. Pensions are cut, public wages are frozen, social programs are dismantled, subsidies are removed from food, from fuel, from medicine, taxes on consumption are raised, the kind of taxes that hit the poor proportionally harder than the wealthy. All of this is framed as necessary restructuring, and perhaps, in some narrow accounting sense, it is. But the question that the accounting never answers is, who is on the operating table? It is never the creditors. It is always the citizens who had the least to do with the debt in the first place. The creditors must be made whole first. That is the architecture of the arrangement. The debt must be serviced before the hospital is funded, before the pension is paid, before the child is fed. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. But even after the austerity, after the fiscal discipline has been imposed, something else happens. Something that requires a particularly cold word to describe. The haircut. When a country's debt is declared unsustainable, when even the IMF acknowledges that full repayment is impossible, creditors are invited to negotiate a reduction. Banks and bondholders are told they will receive less than they were promised. 80 cents on the dollar, 60 cents, sometimes less. This is called a haircut. It sounds almost polite, but here is the cold truth beneath the term. A haircut is not the disappearance of wealth. It is the redistribution of loss. The wealth that was created, the borrowing that funded decades of spending, does not simply evaporate. It was already spent, already extracted, and the people who understood what was coming, the banks with access to sovereign intelligence, the domestic elites with connections to the finance ministry, the institutional investors reading the same internal forecasts as the government, those people moved first. They converted their local currency into hard assets, into foreign accounts, into gold, into real estate months before the announcement arrived. The capital flight always precedes the public crisis. Always. By the time the bankruptcy is declared, the damage is already done for ordinary citizens. Their savings, denominated in the collapsing currency, are worth a fraction of what they were. Their pensions, now subject to restructuring, are halved. The middle class absorbs the loss that the connected class had already escaped. The loss doesn't vanish, it is pushed downward, onto the least mobile, onto those who had no warning and no exit. And then, in the aftermath, when the country lies financially prostrate, the fire sale begins. Because a bankrupt country still has assets. It has airports, power grids, water treatment facilities, port infrastructure, telecommunications networks, state enterprises built over decades with public money, representing the accumulated productive capacity of generations. And now, under the terms of restructuring, under the pressure of creditors who need to be partially compensated, these assets must be monetized. Private equity firms arrive, global infrastructure funds, the entities that critics have taken to calling vulture funds. Investors who specialize not in building things, but in acquiring distressed assets at the moment of maximum desperation. They buy ports for a fraction of their replacement cost. They acquire power companies at prices that would be impossible in any other circumstance. The terms naturally include guaranteed returns, pricing protections, and concession agreements that can last for decades. The nation's future revenue streams, the tolls, the energy fees, the water tariffs that will be paid by its citizens for the next 30 years, are transferred in a single transaction from public ownership to private, often foreign hands, at pennies on the dollar. Bankruptcy, in this sense, is the ultimate wealth transfer, not from rich to poor, from public to private, from national to transnational, from future generations to present creditors. And here's where the most uncomfortable insight lives, the one that reframes everything you thought you understood about why these crises happen and what purpose they serve. Sovereign bankruptcy is not a failure of the global financial system. It is a maintenance procedure. Think about it structurally. Once the debt is restructured, reduced to a level the country can service, and once the assets have been liquidated and transferred to entities that can extract value from them, the country's balance sheet is, in a technical sense, clean. The debt to GDP ratio is manageable again. The IMF declares progress. Credit rating agencies begin upgrading the sovereign. And the international bond market, the same market that had shut its doors, begins offering new loans. The cycle restarts. The country borrows again, often from the same institutions, to finance new infrastructure, new programs, new spending. And the machine begins again, from zero, carrying the logic of the previous cycle forward in structural form. The airports are now owned by foreign funds. The The terms are set, the citizens pay, and the debt accumulates once more toward the next reset. This is not a bug. This is the rhythm. So let us end with a question that does not have a comfortable answer. What is a country in the eyes of global finance? Not a civilization, not a culture, not a people with a shared history and a right to self-determination. In the language of sovereign debt, a country is a balance sheet. It is an entity with revenue streams, an asset base, a credit history, and a debt capacity. Its government is, functionally, its management team, evaluated on its ability to service obligations and maintain the confidence of its creditors. And when that confidence is lost and when the trust collapses, as it always eventually does, the reckoning is not about justice. It is about accounting, about determining with clinical precision who owns what remains. A national bankruptcy is not the end of the world. It is the moment the world decides who owns the world. The sovereignty was always conditional. The credit score was always the real constitution. And now, stripped of the ceremony and the rhetoric, the architecture is visible at last.